Cockroaches, rats, mold, unsafe structures, evictions, water damage, and renovictions. These are the common experiences you hear from tenants in Montreal. So why are landlords who violate laws, regulation, and common sense allowed to continue? At a time when Berliners just voted to expropriate hundreds of thousands of units controlled by the city's biggest landlords, what are we doing to address these issues in a timely way? Today we're going to talk about the rising rents and poor conditions of housing in Montreal. This is Local 514, and I'm your host, Savannah Craig. We'll also be hearing from Sam Harper, a journalist who exposed a Facebook group where landlords discussed how to evict tenants. And we'll hear from Amy Darwish, from Comité d'Action de Park Extension, considering housing rights. This year, Quebec landlords were allowed to increase their rent for their tenants by 2.3%. This was limited from the 3% in 2020. This is newly released guidelines from the Administrative Court of Housing, also known as TAL and formerly known as the Régie du Logement. In Montreal alone, rents increased by 4.6% between 2019 and 2020. The average rent for available unoccupied units in Montreal rose from $910 in 2019 to $1,198 in 2020. This marks a 30% increase. On Kijiji, rent hikes are seen for as much as 8% for listings in Montreal. How are landlords getting away with this? One of the methods are renovictions. This is when a landlord will evict a tenant on the premise of renovating their property, ultimately exponentially raising the rent after and putting it out for a new tenant. This has led to rapid gentrification in many neighborhoods across the island, notably Saint-Henri and the Plateau. But tenants aren't only affected by rising rents and renovictions. Cases where landlords avoid addressing issues or repairs with the apartment and even use different tactics, such as gaslighting tenants, to keep them limited in what they can do. Local 514 video journalist Aude Simon spoke with different Montrealers about their experiences with landlords. Here's what they had to say.
The first bad experience I had a landlord who basically saw me as a dollar sign. So it was really interesting because I would communicate with him. I'd say, oh, there's a problem with the fire alarm, or there's a problem with the oven. And it would just be dead silence. But then as soon as there was a question about money, or, oh, I missed, an extra little bit of the payment because I moved in a little bit earlier, or if there's anything off about the money, he would respond right away, like right on time. So it really made me feel uncomfortable. It made me feel unheard, because I knew that at the end of the day, I was just a bottom line for him. I wasn't a person. And this escalated to a point where I had a lot of problems with my roommate, because what would happen is we would have problems with the stove, and then that would set off the fire alarm. And then so I would come home late for work, I would be making some food. One day I was just boiling water. The fire alarm goes off, wakes her up, and she's furious, and I don't blame her. But at the same time, I need to eat. I just worked an 8-hour shift. What am I to do? And it really created a lot of conflict within the household. And then at the end of the day, we had to leave, and it just was a really bad experience all around.
I've had two really bad experiences with landlords. The first one was when I first moved to Montreal. So I'm an out-of-province student, so I was coming here for the first time, and I wasn't able to look at apartments in person. And I got connected with somebody on Kijiji who showed me pictures of this apartment, and it looked great, and I paid a deposit. I didn't know that in Quebec you don't need to pay a deposit, and it's actually illegal to do that, or to demand that of tenants. So I paid this deposit. I think I was 17 at the time. And then when I came to visit Concordia, I also went and asked to visit this apartment, and the apartment that they brought me to was a completely different space than the photos that they had showed me when I gave them money. So they brought me to a place on Bishop, which actually has burned down since then. And it had 10 units. The units were set up like a hostel style, and there was multiple fridges in the kitchen, and the rent was still over $500 a month. It wasn't, I wasn't going really cheap and really trying to skirt around. I was paying normal amount of rent for Montreal. So I ended up saying no, I'm not going to live here. And they brought me to another unit that they owned. This unit was a normal apartment. It was 2 bedrooms, big kitchen, big living room, normal space. So I'm like, okay, fine, like this is good, I'll move here in January. And when I get there in January, they put drywall up in the living room and then built walls on the outside and made it into 2 bedrooms. And I had one of the halves of the bedroom for like $550 a month.
So basically when we first visited the apartment with my old roommate, it looked like a really good place, right? Everything was renovated, it was right in the heart of a up and coming trendy neighborhood. So it looked like the perfect setup. The first thing that really rang a bell was when it was time to sign the lease. They were asking for a security deposit for my dog, which they're not allowed to do. And it was like a $500 deposit, right? But the way it was worded as if it was going towards the rent, but it wasn't going towards the rent. It was going towards the dog, and it was supposed to be given back to me at the end. So, on top of asking that, they were asking also for the first and last month. Yeah. So, after talking with so it was representatives of some sort of a firm, kind of. So the landlord wasn't there. It was agents that were dispatched for that, right? We were able to get the $500 waived and the last month rent waived as well, because it's illegal. Under law, they're not allowed to ask that. The only thing they can ask is for the first month in advance. So we had that done, and there was an agreement, an agreement that my dog was allowed to be there. There was no clause saying that he wasn't allowed to be there. We move in, looks good, but rereading the lease, we figure out that section G, where you're supposed to write what the last tenants were paying, was crossed off, which is basically the wrong way to do it. They have to write what the last person was paying. They have to find out what they were paying, and if they don't know, it has to be written that it's not in their knowledge, but instead it was just crossed off. So we did ask him, we did send an email to the landlord where he blatantly said that he had bought back the building from the bank, so he didn't know who the last tenants were or what they were paying. So we decided to go to rental board to have the investigation open, right? Because for us it seemed fishy. We're paying $1,750 for a 5.5 renovated, but not that well. Once we started living in it, things started like not falling properly into place. Not well renovated, $1,750 for a 5.5 in a up and coming, not yet downtown kind of area, you know what I mean? So fast forward to a few months later, we start getting mail from the last tenants. So, you know, Facebook, Instagram, start looking up. I found someone that lived in the apartment on top of us about 11 years ago. They paid $700 for the same apartment. And then the person that was living in our apartment right before we moved in, we're talking about 2018 they moved out, they were paying $950. Yeah. And then when we started talking about who was the landlord and what had happened, they went through the same problems. Rental board, they were almost like a Renovictions situation, and they told us exactly the name of the landlord, which is our landlord, well, my old landlord, and exactly what happened, and they were given money to leave, but too little of an amount.
In an investigation by journalist Sam Harper for Ricochet Media, landlords were found on a private Facebook group sharing information such as tactics to evict tenants, even in cases where the tenant did nothing wrong. So essentially, you spoke about in your article for Ricochet, you mentioned that landlords were exchanging information such as targeting ads for the right type of tenant. However, this was tainted with discrimination. Could you explain a little bit more about this?
Well, there were a lot of, you can see people exchanging different types of advice on how to attract good tenants. One of the most glaring examples was somebody saying, well, what kind of renovations should I do to not have families apply? Or how can I write my ad so that I don't have kids running around on top of me in my apartment? So there are different ways like that. Also, what some of the advice that we could see was, well, don't answer anybody in writing. Ask them to call you or you call them, and kind of hinting that, well, you can tell a lot by a person's voice without actually saying what they were listening for. But so yeah, different advice that's not always overtly suggesting things that are illegal, but always skirting the line. Or
I thought a quote in the article that I thought was quite interesting is one of the owners suggesting, be careful with your questions so you don't discriminate. Instead of asking, do you have children, ask who will live in the accommodation. The same goes for jobs and incomes. What was it like seeing messages like this?
Honestly, it's kind of depressing. I mean, I cover a lot of cybersecurity issues, and at one point I kind of put the Facebook groups aside and went to read the ransomware group websites to just feel better for a few minutes, because that was less depressing, actually. But yeah, because there's a lot of these kinds of suggestions. It's always like, oh, well, like, you can't ask for the social, like, you can't, it can't be mandatory to ask for like the social security number, but we know what happens to those who say no. Or that's a good way to filter people who say no. You don't want those people anyway. Or like that the idea that having a tenant exercise their rights, well, that's a red flag that you really don't want in one of your apartments. So it's kind of depressing and shows that the game is kind of rigged against people looking to rent an apartment at the moment.
On the note of SIN numbers and requesting information like this, landlords in this private Facebook groups have also been noted to request information which breaches privacy. Can you explain a little bit about this and tell us if this put tenants at a disadvantage?
Well, the amount of information that seems to be requested seems to be growing like from year to year. From my discussion with the people at the RECLAC, the Regroupement des Comités Logements, they say, well, tenants are in a pretty bad position when there's so few apartments available that they don't really have the leeway to refuse. So what we're seeing more and more is landlords asking for not just like the social security number to do a credit check, but also a legal history. So if you have a past criminal offense, also asking to speak to your boss, to your former boss, to your former landlord. Also, one thing that seems to be a big deal is that they look in the records of the Tribunal Administratif du Logement, the Régie, and having gone there before is also often taken against. And I mean, there's already been lots of like the privacy commissioner and others have said that this isn't legal, and that the fact that the only thing that a landlord can make sure is that if you're able to pay. So if they're allowed to verify to make sure that the person that they're renting to is able to pay the rent. But I mean, a past criminal offense shouldn't stop somebody from being able to rent an apartment. I've seen even sometimes it's pretty vindictive. It's like, well, if something happens, like go to the régie with them, which will make so they won't be able to rent in the future, or at least landlords will see their name there and then won't rent to them. So there's kind of this like, this vindictiveness that you see coming again and again.
Mm-hmm. There were a lot of really. I wouldn't say shocking, because I've been covering this a little bit, and unfortunately things like Renovictions I've already heard about. But I guess something that was of note to me was noticing that some landlords are discussing how to try to remove a tenant, and a tenant who hasn't done anything wrong. Could you tell us a little bit more about how these landlords are, I guess, essentially helping each other to remove tenants that are well within their rights to stay in this home?
Well, that's, I think, you often have this idea that, the good tenant will be safe. Like if you've been there for 15 years and you always pay on time and you're not making noise. But with the market being the way it is now, the best time to raise rent is in between two different tenants. That's when you have the most, let's say, room to maneuver. So unfortunately, there is a lot of pressure to get rid of tenants or to have like short-term tenants so that you can raise the rent faster. And so yes, there is pressure, and you see these comments like, well, I'm kind of, torn. Should I keep this good tenant, but he's not paying enough and I could get more money, but I don't know if I should get rid of him or not. Or people say, well, how do I do it? And then, asking what's the minimum amount of renovations that they need to do, and different strategies like that to be able to, or like a lot of people are suggesting if they have, is to leave the apartment, like once somebody leaves, to leave the apartment free for a year. And then you can do pretty much whatever you want with the price. So yeah, a lot of different, even for people who have been paying and who have been doing it, like doing everything by the rules, can get kicked out now when the market's kind of in overheating, as we could say.
Okay. And in this group, I guess not all of the landlords are on the same page. Is that right? Some of these landlords
Yes.
don't necessarily agree with the practices of, renovictions or evicting okay tenants and these sorts of tactics?
Not at all. I mean, when you go like the largest group, I mean, a vast majority, I mean, a lot of the comments are about like, do you know a plumber, and do you have suggestions for tiling? And I mean, how would you fix this? I mean, there's a lot of just like regular asking for advice. One thing, I was sent screenshots of reactions after the article came out on Ricochet, which were actually interesting. And even then, some people were going, well, I understand people are upset, but it's not like he invented anything. And say, well, everything that's named in that article, we've all seen on this group. So even people in the group were like admitting that, yes, these things happen and these things do go on. One I didn't include in the article, but I had some screenshots of another group, which is a little bit more radical on the landlord side of things, which was suggesting to people that that weren't in agreement or that were seen as being too pro-tenant to maybe join one of the other communist landlord groups. So yeah, they're not all the same. Some are a little bit more radical, or a bit more. And even inside these groups, there is conflict. Like the administrator did tell me that as soon as she sees anything that's illegal or suggesting how to get rid of tenants, that they flag these posts and take them down. But even then, with that kind of moderation, there's still quite a few that still stay up.
Okay. Thank you for sharing this. I guess you did mention certain updates about the group. Is there anything else you want to share that's happened since you published this piece early September?
It seems to be pretty much the same. There should be a piece coming out in a few days, so I can't say too much about it. About a blacklist of tenants that was advertised on one of these groups. So. That should be coming out in the next couple of days, so then you'll have more details then. But yeah, and even there, that one, I mean, was clearly something that has already been declared illegal. There's court cases in the past about lists like this, but it's still up even a few weeks later. So the moderators didn't think it necessary to take that post down. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sam. And where can we follow you to keep up to date with your future work and the next piece coming out?
On Twitter, it's Acetum, ACETUM. And on the new media, I'm not allowed to say the name yet, but it will be launched this Thursday, so in 2 days.
Okay, great. Looking forward to seeing it. Thank you so much, Sam, for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me.
Have a good day. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye. So with the upcoming municipal elections, what have different parties stated that they will do to address these issues? Projet Montreal has proposed a landlord registry to end renovictions and rent hikes. However, this will only apply to landlords who have buildings with 8 or more units throughout the city of Montreal. This represents nearly 200,000 units. The responsible landlord certification would validate key information like rent prices and building conditions for tenants. It would protect renters from renovictions, as the city must be told of planned work every 5 years to prove its necessity. It would also ensure the health and safety of units, require new plans for things like pest and mold management, and adapt to homeowner assistance programs. The landlord would also be obligated to report rents charged to each unit. Valérie Plante hopes this can be integrated by the end of 2022 or the start of 2023. For Ensemble Montreal, Coder has pledged to hold landlords more accountable. This is by creating a lease registry, which requires homeowners to do an independent inspection of unsanitary conditions in buildings that are 20 years older or more. For Mouvement Montreal, Balarama Holness specifically wants federal lands in the Peel Basin set aside for social and affordable units, rather than ceded to business interests seeking to build a stadium such as to attract Major League Baseball teams. Now we'll hear from some Montrealers who are willing to share their opinions on these policies.
It's too little too late. We're in 2021, the prices of apartments are ridiculously high everywhere in the city. I was looking at apartments even in Pointe Saint Charles right now, and they're charging, I think, $1,900 for a 5.5 in Pointe Saint Charles, not Westmount. So it's ridiculous, right? I think their positioning, the different positionings aren't fully up to par with the reality of citizens like myself who are on the lower end of salary, so living wage. Now I don't have so much to complain about because I have a well-paying job, quote unquote, well-paying job, so I'm able to afford something that's a little bit more expensive. But I've lived for so many years in a precarious situation when it comes to money that I know what that feeling is, and I know that these apartments are ridiculously priced. It's not normal that three-quarters of your income has to go through your living, and then you don't know how you're gonna eat, you don't know how you're gonna dress yourself, you don't know how you're gonna move around. It's not even like being able to afford whatever little joy you want to have, like a little meal out or a little drink if you drink or go to a concert. It's not about that. It's just about basic needs. Just Valérie Plante, she was supposed to have 1,200 social apartments done for people in homeless situation. They had to revise that to 900, and including apartments that already exist from what I was reading. So it's like they were playing on words all the time. I don't believe much of what any elected official has to say or even what they're promising until it's happening. And up until now, Valérie Plante hasn't proven to be up to par when it comes to the situation of poorer citizens of Montreal.
From the provinces that I've heard from Projet Montréal, I don't believe, I think that their track record has shown pretty clearly that they don't follow through on any of their promises except for increasing the budget of the SPVM. And so when I hear stuff like that, it really means nothing to me. What is I feel like there's not clear details on what the registry would really include and what benefits it can even have to tenants when we have a housing crisis and a supply issue, because you can know that a landlord is bad, but you'll still have to sign a contract with him if you are needing a place to live and this is the place that you can afford and it's a good location and you'll be happy there, right? And you just have to take on the burden of knowing that you're going to have to struggle with this landlord, or that you're going to have to take on the expenses that a landlord should be taking on, because tenants don't have any leverage in the housing market right now because of how out of hand it is. And governments like Laplante's government are the reason that housing has gotten so out of control in Montreal in the last 4 or 5 years, right?
Parkx is a community home to nearly 100 ethnic groups from around the world, as 90% of residents originate from outside of Canada or have one or two parents from outside of the country. With construction of the University of Montreal campus nearby, this has led to rapid gentrification in the area, which has flooded Parkx and pushed people out of their homes. Amy Darwish of the Comité d'Action de Parc Extension is joining us today. This is a group mobilizing to improve housing conditions for the most disadvantaged in the neighborhood of Parkx. Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Savannah. Thanks for having me on the show.
Happy to have you. So, Amy, can you tell us a little bit? I'm sure there's a lot you could say, but essentially in brief, how are landlords affecting the neighborhood of Parkx?
Well, the tenants in the neighborhood have really been under an enormous amount of pressure due to rent increases and evictions. We've really been seeing rents skyrocket in the neighborhood. At this point, it's impossible to find a 4.5 that's less than $1,200 a month. A lot of landlords are also hoping to benefit from the influx of students and professionals into the neighborhood. We've seen a real wave of evictions in the neighborhood over the last few years, and especially in the last two. The number of people who are coming in to seek support for evictions have basically doubled last year. Beyond that, we're also seeing an enormous amount of housing discrimination, and in particular, it tends to target families, it tends to target immigrants and people of color, and people who are living on low incomes. We're very, very worried that this is going to change the face of Parkx as we know it.
Thank you for sharing. So as many of the residents of Parkx are low incomers, are low income and newcomers to Canada, how does class and immigration play a role in tenants being, I guess, abused, but maybe more easily abused and mistreated by their landlords?
In particular, so Parkx has always been historically a place where working class and low income migrants have tended to call home. There are a lot of people in the neighborhood who are refugee claimants who are living without papers. In a lot of ways, it makes it a lot harder for people to defend their housing rights. A lot of tenants, it's just not really an option for them to have to go to the Tribunal Administratif du Logement. Others are afraid that, for example, if they pick a fight with their landlord, that the landlord might call the cops or might denounce them to immigration. I've definitely heard anecdotally instances where landlords brought that up as a threat. In a lot of ways, what this does is it discourages people from coming forward when they are facing abuses on the part of their landlord. In addition, it also means that tenants often have fewer options where affordable housing is concerned. Right now, social housing is only accessible to people who are citizens or who are permanent residents. If you're a refugee claimant, if you don't have papers, you just can't access it. It leaves you with very, very little in the way of options for affordable housing.
In terms of refugees and immigrants not having access to social housing, people without status, I guess what's the goal? What could you see as being able to put these people in affordable social housing?
So basically what would need to change is the Société d'Habitation du Québec's attribution criteria just needs to change. It just needs to cease to exclude people on the basis of their status. Beyond that, we also support the calls made by Solidarity Across Borders, the Immigrant Worker Center, and other migrant justice groups for a comprehensive and ongoing regularization program for all migrants who have precarious or no status. We think absolutely, the access to housing is very much something that comes through status for all, and we demand regularization for everyone.
When we think of illegal rent hikes, renovictions, and landlords ignoring repairs, things like this, What is Cape mostly seen happen within Parkx, just in terms of this, maybe more renovictions, landlords just kind of getting out of doing necessary repairs?
I mean, we've really seen both of those things, you know, in many ways over the last few years. For example, we've seen a lot of abusive rent hikes. A lot of landlords will put pressure on tenants sometimes to accept $100 or $200 in increases, and tenants are often afraid that they'll lose their apartments and won't find anywhere else to go, or will have to leave the neighborhood, and it puts an enormous amount of pressure on to accept them. In other instances, landlords will use the pretext of renovations to try to force tenants out of their homes. In other instances, they'll use all kinds of tactics, such as telling them that their leases won't be renewed, and in a growing number of instances, harassment, intimidation, and threats as a way of putting pressure on tenants to force them out of their homes. We're also seeing we're also seeing a number of tenants who then have no choice but to, to accept apartments that are too small or that are in very poor condition. This is very much the other side of the housing crisis. That it creates a lot of impunity for landlords to just not do basic repairs, to neglect buildings, because they know that there are a lot of people who can't afford to find somewhere else to live.
And in terms of maybe those who are unaware of the rental legal support system, possibly facing language barriers, are these services that CAPE provides in support of, or are there other sorts of services in Parkx and maybe beyond that will help people within these situations?
I mean, people have often talked about Park Extension as being historically one of the poorer neighborhoods, but it is a neighborhood that is an enormous amount of enormous amount of mutual aid and support networks in the neighborhood. We do offer support to tenants in a number of different languages, including Hindi, Punjabi, Urdu, Arabic and Spanish and other languages. We've also more recently tried to adapt our popular education material to translate it into multiple languages in order to reach more tenants who maybe who read and understand languages that aren't English or French. We've started doing a seasonal postering campaign 3 to 4 times a year to this end. There are also a number of other networks in the neighborhood, among them Africo Féminin, the Ressources Action Alimentation, among the CHES, many others that offer an enormous amount of support to the tenants of the neighborhood.
Thank you. So I'm sure you've heard of this, but Valérie Plante, one of her campaign promises is that essentially she wants to make this landlord registry that would, hold landlords more accountable, reduce the cases of renovictions, keep a track record of previous rents. However, this would only be for buildings with 8 or more units. Will this benefit Parkx? What are your thoughts in general on this proposal?
For sure, it's a step in the right direction. There are questions that remain, for example, about what happens if a landlord doesn't, loses that certification. What does that mean for their building? What does that mean for the tenants who live there? These are definitely questions that we would need to be answered. Above all, we're disappointed to hear that it only applies to buildings with 8 units or more. While that's obviously excellent news for tenants in larger buildings, there are also tenants who are living, in the smaller multiplexes who are facing an enormous amount of pressure from their landlords. And these protections absolutely need to apply to them as well.
Thank you. In general, I guess, with the municipal elections coming up and promises around things such as social housing and tenant rights, do you trust these campaign promises? Do you think that promises such as this will really be followed through with?
What I do think they demonstrate is the groundswell of grassroots pressure and momentum around around affordable housing in Park, not just in Park Extension, but in neighborhoods across the city. Like we've seen tenants mobilizing in a number of different neighborhoods, including Verdun, the Plateau, Saint-Henri, among, more recently a Huntsic-Cartierville, among many others. I think what this demonstrates is that, that increasingly tenants are mobilizing and are organized. And the fact that, that that the municipal candidates have felt the need to address this in the housing crisis in their campaigns demonstrates, that there's real tenant power. I also believe that whatever the outcome of this election, it will be that kind of grassroots organizing that will deliver real gains in terms of protections for tenants and building more social housing.
Thank you, Amy. Lastly, I just want to ask, is there anything that hasn't been promised by municipal candidates that you would really like to see to make the situation better?
We've seen very little in the way of real commitments around social housing so far. For example, Valerie Plante announced that they would be devoting $800 million to build 60,000 units of affordable housing. However, as we know, affordable housing is basically established as 90% of the market rate when the market rate is completely unaffordable. Those units are actually just not affordable to the vast majority of tenants who are living in precarious situations and need access to housing. We think there needs to be much clearer commitments where social housing is concerned. There's been absolutely no commitments whatsoever from Ensemble Montréal. I think there is a real urgency to act around this in terms of building more units of social housing so that, those who are living, on low incomes, who are facing, rent increases and evictions, have real options in terms of being able to stay in the neighborhoods that they love and call home.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks for having me today, Savannah.
Stay in touch. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Now we'll hear from some Montrealers who suggest what can be done to aid the situation.
I really like social housing as a concept, but I don't like social housing that's managed by the municipality. There's one of the worst like slum sort of buildings in Toronto is managed by the municipality of Toronto. But if you have social housing that operates under like a co-op model where people can participate in the social housing, people take ownership over it. They don't, people will say, oh, we can't have social housing because people don't take care of it and people will like ruin it, When they're not being managed and they're not being treated like they're an income supply for the city and rather that they're like citizens who deserve housing and that's what they're getting, people don't ruin things, right? Like when you look at the metro, people are really proud of the metro and the metro is so clean compared to other cities. And we can have that sort of mentality towards social housing, I think. I also think that one of the issues that Montreal has specifically is that students drive up the cost of housing for people who are from Montreal. And a really simple solution to that is to give universities funding for student-only buildings. Concordia Student Union has made a student-only building in the Plateau, and I think that makes a lot of sense because it takes students away from being in competition with people who are from Montreal and who are raising their families here. When students might have like ways that they can, students drive up rents like the first way that you kind of like know that you're being gentrified, and it kind of sucks knowing that like, yeah, I'm moving into a neighborhood, I'm actively low-key gentrifying it, but I genuinely can't afford to live elsewhere and the city hasn't made room for me even though they rely on students, and this is like the highest concentration of students of any other city in North America. So ignoring students as being kind of like a separate population, I think really like devalues housing and makes it really difficult for people who are from here to continue to own like cheap housing and to maintain these like low rent costs that bring students here in the first place.
The registry is important, but not only for 8 units and more. For everybody who owns a building, whether it's 1 unit, 2 units, 10 units, it doesn't matter. The registry has to be done. A revising of rents has to be done towards the lower end. So we have to hit down the prices, which I guess it's never gonna happen, you know, because capitalism, yay. What else needs to be done? We have to. The problem is that the way the laws are built at the moment, they're built to benefit landlords. So it's extremely hard and extremely anxiety inducing to try to go through rental board, and it's not clear. And they do offer through a third party legal help, but even so, it's hard to have the line, it's hard to get an email back, it's hard to be able to be advised properly. It can take up to a month before you get answered, right? So if it's time sensitive, you don't really have much help. So better legal services to help tenants. The ban on animals has to be fully taken out. It's a ridiculous clause to have in a lease, right? Because the reality is a lot of us do have animals, and for someone like me, my animals are a big help to my anxiety and to my depression problems, right? So when I have my animals around me, it helps me go through my days. The landlords that have been found guilty of renovictions have to be fined. And all that money should go into social housing. We should put a stop to condos. The amount of buildings that are happening, new developments, condos here, condos there, condos there, condos, and these condos are at prices that are so high that none of us can actually afford them. And it ends up being built quickly, poorly built. There's a few social housing supposed to, but now with everything that came out in the news lately of these developers renting to their sons and the friend of their son and people who have money, right? So these social housing are not going to us, the people who need it. So all these developments of buildings should be stopped fully, and there should be an incentive for people living in the city, from the city, to get a better access to owning condos, houses. And I do believe, but that might be a lot, I do believe that the government should be paying for, if you don't own a house, if you're renting, it's the government who should be paying for you to live somewhere. I do believe that. Is it ever going to happen? I don't know. But I do think that it should be part of it, or at least pay for part of it, right? Because we all need to live. If everyone has somewhere to live paid for, then everyone can find a job, work, contribute to the economy, right? Fall into the whole capitalism system, and then slowly but surely roll out poverty and have everybody being in a good situation of living, or at least a decent one, right?
I think it's really frustrating when we talk about landlords as if they provide housing to us, when, like you mentioned before, that there might be some sort of registry for landlords who have more than 8 properties, so that they can be held accountable in some way. It's like, why is one person allowed to own more than 8 properties when there are people in the city who can't even afford to rent one of those properties? It makes no sense, and it doesn't make sense to me that we would keep track of who those people are rather than just cap how many properties people can own, so that the market is open to everybody and people aren't excluded.
I just think that as a society, we need to do better, and I think that as citizens, between each other, we need to start standing up with each other and holding hands towards the bettering of the situation. Because the reality is, you don't know when, even the people who are middle class and even higher class when it comes to the income, you don't know when something might hit and day in, day out, you have no more money and you're in the streets. And then you need to rely on whoever's around you. What are you going to do then? So I think this situation is really not a individualistic situation, but it's a problem as a society that we all need to work towards bettering together.
That's all the time we have today. Thanks everyone for joining us. See you next time.